All right, we're going to start things up and away we go. Good evening and welcome to the sixth presentation for the 2022-23 season of Avalanche Canada's webinar series. My name is Brent Strand. I'm the producer for the night. Lisa Perizzoli is online and she's going to be the moderator, looking out for your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For the last 2 years, we presented a variety of webinars and found that being online means we get to share avalanche safety messaging with even more of you than ever before. We're glad you're with us this evening and spending your time. We'd love to see you share these webinars with others throughout the winter. They're recorded and they're available online. Our mission is to help educate backcountry users so you can go out and play safe. We want you all to know more, go further, and come home. First off, we'd like to acknowledge that our session is being hosted in the territory of 4 nations, the Sinnix, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, and the Silks. As a national organization, we also acknowledge the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations whose land we live and recreate on. Before we start tonight's session, I'd really like to thank our sponsors. We're very grateful for our sponsors being loyal in their support for us during these challenging economic times and working with us to reach backcountry users this winter. This webinar tonight is sponsored by Mammut. Mammut has been a long-time sponsor of Avalanche Canada, and we're thrilled with their ongoing commitment to avalanche safety. Mammut has just released a new line of airbag vests for sledders. The Mammut free airbag vests are lightweight and fit tightly to keep that weight from bouncing around while still allowing you to move freely. And hey, be sure to stick around tonight because at the end, we got a good draw prize from the Mammut. Folks, we got a 30-liter backpack that's airbag compatible. So stick around and maybe you're going to win a freebie down the road. So a couple housekeeping notes. First off, everyone is muted automatically. There's going to be an opportunity to ask questions. To do so, you can either click on the raise hand icon in the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll unmute you and you can ask a question of the presenter and then I'll meet you back up and away we go from there. Another way is to type it into the Q&A box. It's also found at the bottom of your screen. And let's use the Q&A box for questions because in the chat box, we're going to be populating those with web links and stuff along that lines. And it's just easier to follow your questions and track them in the Q&A box. So we super appreciate that. Tonight's presentation, choosing terrain for snowmobilers. Terrain choice, it's always the answer to having a safe, fun day out in the backcountry. When the avalanche hazard's high or you're concerned about certain avalanche problems, and you want to be able to recognize the terrain is safe, and more importantly, which terrain is not safe. You're in for a treat tonight because we've got Avalanche Canada's Northwest Field Tech, Emily Jones. She's going to go and lead you through a variety of images and exercises to help you hone your terrain choice skills. Emily will be presenting various scenarios of terrain combined with the danger rating, and your questions are really welcome at this point. They're most valuable if you chime in right away during the current scenario so you don't get left behind. We're going to try and address the questions and stuff to her as soon as we can. So don't be bashful and, raise your hand. That's the best way, getting that verbal interaction. That'll be really good. And then we can get good, clear questions to Emily. So about Emily, she spent the last 10 years living in winter, working as an avalanche technician and forecaster for ski areas in New Zealand, Colorado, British Columbia. She's got a really strong passion for teaching and mentoring. Before joining Avalanche Canada's team, she worked as an Avalanche educator. So without further ado, I'm going to pass along to Emily now, and I hope you folks enjoy the presentation tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brent, for that introduction. And yeah, like Brent said, I'm really happy and excited to be here and to talk to you all. Let me just start sharing my screen. And we will get right into it. Okay.
Perfect. Looking good, Emily.
Awesome. Alrighty. So choosing terrain for sledders. Hopefully you all have gotten out at least once this winter already. And if not, I hope that this presentation will help you choose some good terrain, some safe terrain when you do get out on your sleds. So just a quick rundown on what we're going to be talking about today. Firstly, I'm just going to cover some avalanche terrain basics. So this might be a recap for some of you, but identifying terrain that is avalanche and isn't avalanche terrain is obviously first and foremost when we're choosing the terrain that we want to go sledding in. Then I'm going to give you some helpful tools to keep in your back pocket or in your tunnel bag that you can use while you're out and about during your sledding day. That will help you both with identifying avalanche terrain and moving through that terrain. Then we're going to talk about the juicy stuff. So interpreting the avalanche bulletin and how we apply that to the terrain that we're in. We're going to go over some real life scenarios and do some decision making together. And hopefully that will be beneficial for you all. So you can see some different avalanche problems and how we would make decisions around those and in different pieces of terrain while we're out there. Then we'll have a summary and I'll give you guys some time for questions. But like Brent said, if at any point during the presentation you do have questions, just feel free to pop those into the chat box the Q&A box, and I'll endeavor to answer those on the fly live. And yeah, if you think of them afterwards, then we will also stick around for a little bit after the presentation ends to try and finish answering those questions for you all. Alrighty, let's get into it. So you might have heard the expression, whatever the avalanche problem, terrain is the answer. And that is most definitely correct. And hopefully we'll walk away from today's presentation with lots of tools on how to use terrain as your answer to staying safe in the backcountry. Alrighty, before I kick off though, I do want to know a little bit about you guys. Hopefully tonight is nice and interactive. So Brent's going to bring up our first poll now. And I'd like to know what everyone's level of avalanche education is. So what's your Avy Savvy? Have you done no avalanche training? That's all right if you're here and you're brand new. A little bit, some courses, or whether you're a professional avalanche user. Just give everyone a bit of time. Awesome. Okay, cool. So it looks like the majority of people have done their AST1, but welcome to those of you who are new to the avalanche community and are just getting started on your journey here. Great, thanks for that. Okay, so this here is the avalanche triangle. We need all of these factors to interact in order to produce avalanche hazards. So snowpack and weather conditions interact to produce unstable snow conditions. That could mean avalanches. But without the third piece in the puzzle, without the terrain, we won't see avalanche conditions. And then obviously in the middle there, we have our humans as possibly the trigger, or just interacting with the terrain in order to produce avalanche hazard. Obviously, if we're not out there when the avalanches are happening, then there's no hazard. But today we're going to focus on the bottom part of that triangle, the terrain piece. If we take that away from the avalanche triangle, then we will not have an issue with avalanches. So, some terrain basics. First and foremost, we need a slope that is steep enough to slide in order to produce avalanches. So slope angle is kind of our number one identifier for whether we're in avalanche terrain or not. And this is because avalanches most often occur on slopes with angles between 30 and 45 degrees. If we're on the flat or a slope that's that's lesser than 30 degrees, then usually that slope isn't steep enough for snow to slide on. There are some exemptions to this rule, but this is in general what we'll see when we're out there. And usually on slopes greater than 45 degrees, we won't see dangerous slab avalanche conditions like the one in the picture, because those slopes will slough continuously. And sloughing is when loose, dry snow just falls off steep slopes, like you can imagine a spine in Alaska does. So those slopes will manage themselves a little bit, and a dangerous slab won't necessarily build on those slopes that are so steep. So 30 to 45 degrees is our sweet spot, and that's the terrain that we want to be identifying. But how do we know how steep a slope is? I know from my personal experience that if I'm standing on a slope, looking down something or looking up, that my perception can be really skewed, and it can be quite hard to tell what the actual angle of the slope is. So we want to give ourselves some tools to be able to measure how steep a slope is. So like in this picture here, we can use a compass or an inclinometer to measure the slope angle. But if you don't have one of those, there's tips and tricks that you can find online for using your poles or a probe to find how steep a slope is. And then there's also really great smartphone apps. So I know that when I'm out traveling in the backcountry, I always have my phone with me. And I just have like a bubble level app that you can download from the App Store. And we can use the same technique that we would with our inclinometer, place a probe or a pole along the slope that we're on, and then the phone on top. And that will tell us our slope angle. And I think Lisa is going to link to some of these resources in the chat if you don't get a chance to write them down. So yeah, all of the resources will be available for you afterwards. One of the other tools that I really like to use to work out slope angle is a mapping app called FatMap. You can get this on your device or use it on your desktop computer. And this is a really good way to plan for trips and find out our slope angle online. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here, we have this little layers symbol. And if we click on that, then it brings up all of these different overlays that we can use to put on top of the terrain. And if I select the avalanche overlay, then it's going to bring up the shaded highlights just like this. This is a really popular snowmobile area just outside of Smithers called the Microwave that I visit quite a lot. And if I'm ever wondering about the terrain there, whether it's avalanche terrain or not, or how steep it is, then I can go online and look at this app. And I can do this while I'm in the field as well, about a specific slope. So we can see here that we can quite safely travel along the ridge at the Microwave without actually interacting with any avalanche terrain, because these slopes here aren't steep enough to produce an avalanche. Cool. Okay. So I think that's pretty thoroughly covered slope angle and different ways to measure that. Our next way of identifying avalanche terrain is through the aspect or which direction the slope faces. Normally, we'll talk about this in terms of cardinal direction, so north, south, west, east. And the way to identify this is by standing with your back to the slope, looking out, and the direction that you are facing is also the direction that the slope faces, and that is your aspect. So we can use a compass for that as well, or once again, trusty smartphone. There's a compass app just on the phone that you can search. It should already be installed in your applications. Point that out in front of you, and you'll be able to find out the aspect of the slope that you're on. You can also use all of those really good mapping softwares like FatMap or Gaia GPS, or however you like to plan your trips to find out what aspect you're traveling on. Awesome. And then the other factor for determining where we are in our avalanche terrain is our elevation band. So whether we're in the below tree line, the tree line, or the alpine. And now these features are usually pretty obvious to identify just based on tree cover. But the elevation band is really important because we might see that some avalanche problems exist only in the alpine and not in the tree line or below, or vice versa. When we are in the tree line, it can be really easy to identify avalanche terrain too. You can see here these big scars or avalanche paths from previous or historic avalanches that have run and destroyed the trees in those areas. But something to be wary of when you're in the tree line is that these avalanche paths might not actually be so obvious. So hopefully you can see that here. There's a big crown of a slide, but the tree cover is pretty spread out across the slope. So it's not as obvious to be able to identify the avalanche terrain in this area. So you'll have to use things like your slope angle to determine that. So don't just rely on the tree cover of historic avalanche paths to determine your avalanche terrain. And in this final picture, you can see that in the alpine, it's the same. It might be an entire slope or face that is avalanche terrain. So that's just something to be wary of. Awesome. So one other tool we can use when identifying avalanche terrain is the avalanche terrain exposure scale, or AITS ratings. You might hear us referring to them as. And these AITS ratings were developed by a panel of experts that considered 25 or 30 different terrain characteristics or factors, and then they use that to classify terrain into 3 different categories. And this might all sound a bit overcomplicated, but luckily we have a really nice tool on the Avalanche Canada website. You can see the webpage there, our trip planning tool. And most of our common sledding areas, or at least a lot of the places that are within forecasting regions, have already been mapped, and you can use our interactive map online to zoom in and out of these areas and look at how that terrain has been classified. So the first of the 3 classifications is simple terrain. That's our green areas on the maps. And this terrain is mostly low angle or forested terrain. And in these areas, there are many options to reduce or avoid exposure to avalanche paths or avalanche terrain. So you can see here in the photo, this snowmobiler, he's kind of traveling on the flat, maybe at tree line, and he's in simple terrain there. Something to be wary of is that you may be in the run out zone of large infrequent avalanche paths. But in general, simple terrain, you're able to avoid exposure to those paths. Alrighty, our next level, the purpley blue color, is challenging terrain, and that's when you're exposed to well-defined avalanche paths, starting zones, or terrain traps. And I will talk about terrain traps in a later slide. But when you're in challenging terrain, options do exist to reduce exposure with careful route finding. So you can see our slider in the photo here. There's some very obvious avalanche paths. but there are places where we can travel where we avoid that exposure. But just something to be wary of is that advanced skills on the sled are usually required to avoid avalanche hazard once you get into this kind of terrain. Awesome. And then our last category is complex terrain, the black shading. And that's where you're exposed to multiple overlapping avalanche paths or large expanses of steep open terrain. So just like is pictured here in the photo. There are multiple start zones. There might be terrain traps below. And usually when we're traveling in complex terrain, we're almost entirely in avalanche terrain. So there's very limited or no options available to avoid exposure to avalanche hazard. And when we are in complex terrain, it's important to remember that it requires critical decision-making skills. So usually having at least taken the ASD1 course, which is great. A lot of you have done that, and advanced writing skills. Awesome. Does anybody have any questions about the 8 stuff? If you do right now, you can just pop it into the Q&A box. Otherwise, I'll keep going. You thought I'd just chuck a nice powder shot in here. Awesome. So simple terrain is actually really great for sledding. Not as fun as a skier, but we have the advantage on our snowmobiles that riding powder on flat, simple terrain is actually still really fun. So always a good option on any day, given the hazard. Was there a question there, Brent?
Yep, you got no questions. It looks like you're doing well.
Okay. Maybe they just can't understand my accent.
I think they got it dialed.
Alrighty, so we'll just put that all together quickly. You can see in this photo that we have all 3 kinds of 8s ratings in one area. So you can get in the habit of going to your favorite sledding zones, or especially when you arrive at a new zone, of identifying the terrain, either based on slope angle, whether it's steep enough to slide or not, or using the 8s rating. So we can see here that in the foreground, we've got simple terrain, very low angle, avoids exposure to avalanche paths. Kind of in the 2 corners, we have some well-defined avalanche paths, some challenging terrain. And then in the back here in this face, there's an area of complex terrain where if we were riding those slopes, we wouldn't be able to avoid exposure to avalanche terrain at all. And these, the changes when we're moving between this terrain is a good time to maybe stop, shut off our sleds and have a helmets off chat. Like it's a key decision-making point. If we're moving from simple into challenging terrain or from challenging into complex terrain, I would call that a key decision-making point where we can have a helmets off chat about whether we want to proceed or not, and how we're going to approach moving through that terrain. Cool. All right. I said I would talk about terrain traps, and I will. So if you don't know what a terrain trap is an area of terrain where if we were to be involved in an avalanche, it would greatly increase the consequences. So making a much worse outcome for ourselves if we were to be in an avalanche in that spot. So examples of terrain traps include things like creek gullies or other hollows that are created in the terrain, where if we triggered a slide there, we would get buried significantly deeper, or we would get buried where in an open slope, we wouldn't get buried at all. And terrain traps can also be things like hollows around the bases of trees, or just being pushed into those trees by an avalanche. So yeah, they increase the risk if an avalanche pushes you into them. So that's something to be wary of, and something else to identify as we're moving through terrain. Okay, just to cover this one more time, because sometimes I think it can be deceptive, especially when we're on our sleds traveling on a flat groomed trail. If you're on the flat slope angle 0 degrees, you can still be in avalanche terrain. So like you can see in this example here, if we're traveling along this groomed trail, we're still in the run out of this avalanche. path. So there's still the possibility, even though we're on flat terrain, that we can be in avalanche terrain. So that's something that's worth considering as you're moving around on your sled. And just to define the run out zone, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a deposition zone, but that's where the debris of an avalanche or the finish of an avalanche can come to rest. So you see here, the start zone's often way up in the alpine, or at least at the top of the tree line. The avalanche runs down the track and into the run out zone. But in both these photos, you can see how the run out zone is really quite flat. So yeah, we want to always be thinking about that as we're moving through terrain, not just the slope we're on, but the slopes that we're could be affected by or that surround us. Awesome. So let's try and put it all together. If we're standing at the bottom of a slope, thinking about whether it's safe to ride right now, firstly, we want to think about whether it's avalanche terrain. So using the slope angle or our 8s ratings, we want to know what aspect it is, what elevation band we're in, and what are the potential consequences if there was to be a slide there. So are there any terrain traps or other characteristics of the slope that would highlight a red flag? Great. Okay, now we're into the juicy stuff. So the next step after we've identified the avalanche terrain is to apply the avalanche bulletin to the terrain that we're in. And I like to think about this as whether or not an avalanche problem exists where I am at this moment. Okay, so just a quick little recap on the avalanche bulletin. You find that at avalanche.ca. Once you found the area that you're riding in, and this year we have a great interactive map. You can either search for your sledding area, just type that into the search bar, or you can just zoom in and drop a pin on your location and the forecast for your region will just pop up on your screen. We have our danger ratings tab, which is the first one that just highlights the overall avalanche hazard for your different elevation bands. Then we have our avalanche problem tab. So that goes into a little bit more detail about the different kinds of avalanche problems that are going to be there. And then finally, we have the details tab. So a little summary of recent avalanches, the snowpack and the weather in your area. And that's kind of a deeper dive. But let's go back to problems, because this is where we're going to find where our avalanche problem exists in the terrain. So you can see here that each different problem, we're identifying what elevation it exists at. So this first problem here, wind slab, exists in the alpine and tree line, and which slopes or which aspects that avalanche problem is on. So you can see here that northwest through southeast slopes are affected by that wind slab hazard. Alrighty, and then if we go back to the danger rating tab, you can scroll down there and you'll see a travel and terrain advice box. And I think that this is a really great feature. Our forecasters put a huge amount of effort into this travel and terrain advice section. And they specifically write this each day based on what the avalanche problem is. So you'll see specific advice here about the things that you can be doing on that day as you're traveling through terrain, or things that you can identify while you're out there to use as tools while you're on your sled. So for example, the bulletin yesterday in my area was advising conservative route selection and resisting venturing out into complex terrain. So just resisting venturing out into complex terrain is a really great way to eliminate the hazard by avoiding everything that we've defined as black or complex terrain. And then you can see there that there's all sorts of different travel advice. So yeah, I'd really advise you to scroll down in the danger ratings tab and to read this information, because I think that that's really good and it's really personalized to each and every forecast. Okay, another poll. How do you guys use the avalanche bulletin? Are you normally just looking at the color, the danger ratings, or are you reading all 3 pages, including the details? Or do you not read the bulletin at all before heading out? Okay, bit of a mixed bag. Awesome. Wow, there's a lot of you out there who are reading all 3 pages, including the details. That's awesome. All right. Okay, moving on. Okay, so now we kind of know how to read the bulletin. We're going to apply the avalanche problems that we're finding in that problems tab to the terrain that we're going into. And I like to think about this as like either having a 3D scale model in front of me that I'm applying the problems to, so that I can think about the elevation and aspect in kind of a 3-dimensional way, or it's almost like putting on a coat. If you're the terrain, you're applying those avalanche problems to that terrain and putting them on there, overlaying that onto the terrain that you're going to be traveling in. So in this example, I guess I already said it. Yeah, elevation and aspect, and we're applying that to the terrain that we're going to be traveling in, thinking all the time while we're out there, what elevation band am I in and which slopes am I on? What aspect am I on? Okay, and you can see here that can change depending on the avalanche problem. So on any given day, there could be up to 3 different avalanche problems listed in the bulletin. And some of those problems might be on all aspects or all elevations, and some of them might only be on specific aspects or specific elevation bands. Alrighty, now we're going to get into some scenarios. So for each of these, I'm going to run through what the avalanche danger is and what the problem is, where we'll find that problem in the terrain. And then I'm going to show you some terrain photos, and we're going to try to overlay those problems onto the terrain and think about where would be safe and places that we would want to avoid as we're traveling through that terrain. So scenario 1, we have moderate danger in the alpine and tree line elevations bands, and our avalanche problem is wind slab. It exists at alpine and tree line elevations, and it's on north through south slopes. So north, northeast, east, southeast, and south facing slopes. Alrighty, and in this first photo, hopefully you can tell which way my compasses are pointing, but we can see here that north is where those shady rolls are facing. And so we want to think about where the avalanche problem exists in this terrain. And if we're thinking about the aspect, so which direction these slopes are facing, these slopes are all going to be within the defined avalanche problem. So these slopes either face north or east, and north and east slopes in today's scenario all have the avalanche problem there, the wind slab there. And I would also point out some terrain features here. So all of these shady rolls, convexities that I've highlighted, and these are gullies. that are down in the front here that could be terrain traps. Those are places that we're really likely within this terrain to find our wind slab problem. So that's not to say we wouldn't find it on all of these avalanche slopes. But I think these are like really likely trigger points for today's scenario. Alrighty. But I've reversed my compass now. So if north is the other way and what we're looking at is a west face, so all of these slopes here are west facing. We've identified that using our compass as we're traveling up to this vantage point here. Does the avalanche problem exist in this terrain now? And if we look back here at what our bulletin says, no, it doesn't exist on westerly aspects. So then this slope would be safe or safer to ride. We don't think that our wind slab problem exists here on westerly slopes today. So you can see here how this is really important to our decision making, especially identifying what aspect we're traveling on. Of course, if I was to start sledding on this slope, me and my friends or my workmates for the day, we would still want to use our good travel habits, practice things like starting small and going one at a time. But for the most part, we do not think that the avalanche problem exists here today. Alrighty, I'm going to roll. Oh, so in that scenario, I talked about elevation band and aspect, but what about an 8's rating for this terrain or the slope steepness? Think about that in your heads for a little bit. Do you think it's simple terrain, challenging terrain, complex terrain? Can we avoid the avalanche paths? Or is it really exposed? I think here is challenging terrain. So I think options exist for avoiding exposure to avalanche paths. And in the foreground here, I think we're far enough away from these slopes and the slope extends flat there in front of us that would be defined as simple terrain. So those are also choices you can make in either scenario about where you're going to travel. Alrighty, scenario 2. What about let's start with the 8's ratings for this terrain. So once again, just in your heads, thinking about areas that are simple terrain, where there's no exposure to avalanche paths, challenging and complex terrain. I'll just give you a beat. Alrighty. And so I think this piece here in the middle that I've highlighted with green would be simple terrain. So lots of flat areas, and you can see all of the snowmobile tracks in there already. And we can avoid the exposure from the paths above. Then we have some challenging terrain in front of us. And in the background, those big steep alpine faces, more complex terrain. Okay, so now let's put an avalanche problem onto this terrain. So again, we have moderate hazard for wind slab in the alpine and tree line. And that wind slab exists on north through south slopes. So northerly slopes are going to be those big shady faces pointing straight at us in this scenario. And where do we think that our avalanche problem exists? So once again, in your mind, try to visualize the areas where the problem does exist, those aspects, and think about whether slopes are alpine or tree line. Alrighty, so highlighted in yellow to show the moderate rating. All of those slopes there in the background, those slopes we identified as complex, those do have the avalanche problem because they're north facing. But the slope here in the foreground is west facing in this scenario. So the avalanche problem doesn't exist here. And we also have that piece of flat, simple terrain where we can avoid the overhead hazard from the wind slabs, the slopes that do have the wind slab on them, and ride safely in that flat meadow. Awesome. I think you guys are getting the picture now, probably. Cool. So a third scenario, this time we have considerable hazard in the alpine and moderate hazard at tree line and below tree line. But we have a wet loose problem that exists on all aspects, and it's on east through west slopes. So that includes our southerly slopes or our sunny facing slopes in the northern hemisphere. Nice. And in this photo here, all of these trees, the tree slopes in front of the snowmobilers are south facing. So does our avalanche problem exist on these slopes? Yes. So we have that moderate hazard at tree line for our wet loose problem because we are traveling on south facing aspects. And then I've just highlighted in green here a piece of flatter or simple terrain that would be a good choice for the given scenario because it avoids exposure to the avalanche terrain or therefore the avalanche hazard. Alrighty, so now we have the same scenario for the avalanche problem. The avalanche problem still exists at all elevations and on east through west slopes, so south facing slopes. But what about this piece of terrain? So the slopes we're looking at are mostly shady, predominantly north facing. Does our avalanche problem exist on these slopes, or are we free to go and ride it? Yeah, nice. We're going to ride this terrain because our avalanche problem does not exist here. It does not exist on northerly aspects. Awesome. Let's roll straight into scenario number 4. So got the traffic light, considerable, moderate, low hazard, and our problem exists on alpine aspects only, on west through east aspects, so west, north, and easterly facing slopes. And it's a cornice problem. And you can see here that south facing slopes, these ones in the sun, are going to be the ones that don't have our avalanche problem. Oh, firstly, I've identified this here in the middle as sorry, I didn't talk about elevation bands. So our avalanche problem in this scenario only exists in the alpine. So we can identify tree line and below tree line terrain to ride in that avoids this avalanche problem. So the yellow color here showing the tree line terrain, that would be safe as long as we're avoiding any overhead exposure from cornices. Then in orange, our considerable danger rating for all of these west, north, and east facing slopes that have our cornice problem on them. And then here we have this chunk of terrain in the middle that's south facing. So it is in the alpine, so we do need to be wary that we're not changing aspect without realizing, or we don't have the problem as an overhead. That might be a concern as you get into the top parts of the slope here. But if we're riding down here in the tree line, or we're sure we're on south facing slopes, then I think we can avoid the avalanche problem in this given scenario. Alrighty, another scenario for you. I'm going to add on to our cornice problem. So we still have our cornice problem in the alpine on west through east facing slopes, but we're going to add that wet loose problem that exists on all aspects on east through west facing slopes. So the southerly half of the compass. So the exact opposite slopes that the cornice problem is on. So we have the same piece of terrain. Where are those wet loose problems going to be today? So I think that these are south facing slopes that we identified in when the picture was up earlier, are going to be a problem for our for our wet loose problem, sorry. But I've got some question marks for you guys down here. I think that potentially this piece of terrain and this piece of terrain, we don't know what's behind us in this photo, but these areas could be simple terrain. So they look flat enough to me that they wouldn't produce an avalanche. But the one thing that we have to be wary of in this scenario is that we have multiple avalanche problems and we really want to avoid exposure from overhead slopes. So there's the possibility on this side of the flat meadow that we could be underneath some of our cornice problem. And if the slopes behind me from where I'm taking this photo here are south facing and quite steep, then we might be under the overhead hazard of our wet loose problem. So just running all of these scenarios through your mind and really being aware of what aspect and elevation you're on as you move through that terrain. All right, one more scenario for you guys. So this might come up later in the season when you go riding. Sometimes like once we stop producing avalanche bulletins in the spring, you'll just see the spring conditions symbol come up. So we don't put a rating out after the avalanche forecasting season ends, but there might be times where you're still riding when the snow conditions are still good later into the spring. And during these spring conditions, we want to avoid sunny slopes, predominantly south-facing slopes, especially in the later part of the day as they warm up, lose cohesion in the snow, and become more dangerous throughout the day. So in this scenario, aspect is really important, whether it's a south-facing or a north-facing slope. And under these conditions, I would say that this shady area is a much safer place to ride than the solar slope that you can see the track and snowmobiler on. Cool. Alrighty. Just a few more scenarios for you guys. So we have our wind slab problem again. And that is at alpine and tree line elevations. And it's on west through east facing slopes. So west, north, and east facing slopes in the alpine and tree line. And I've drawn a couple of lines here, imaginary sled riders going up the slope. And I'd like to know from you guys which line you would choose as the safest way to get into the alpine on this given scenario. So, and when we look at the photo, the right-hand slopes, the ones that are kind of more obviously in the shade, are north facing. The ones facing directly towards us are east facing. And then the ones over to the left are south facing slopes. So have a think about which line you would think would be the safest way to get into the alpine, where the avalanche problem exists and where it doesn't exist. And we're going to do a little poll on this one. Could be multiple correct answers. Doesn't matter if you're wrong, we're going to talk about it. Alrighty, lots of you like red, a few of you like orange, and some of you like black. Not very many of you like blue, which is great. Awesome. So it looks like a lot of you have been able to identify the fact that our avalanche problem exists on those north-facing slopes that the blue line is traveling on. So that's one I would immediately eliminate from the scenario. Blue is definitely not my preferred option. I'll just talk about them from right to left. So orange, I really like some of the things that the orange line has done, especially as they're getting up into the Alpine there. They're traveling along a ridge line, which is normally a safe spot. So that's good safe travel practices. But down lower here, they do travel across this east-facing slope in the tree line, and that's where our avalanche problem exists. So at tree line on east-facing slopes, we do find the wind slab. So this could be a bit of a problem area for the orange line. I'll talk about black next. So they're also traveling across this steep face and then way up until onto this big face on an east-facing slope where our wind slab problem exists. So black definitely wouldn't be my preferred option either. And then red is awesome. So I've tried to draw it so it looks like they're traveling across kind of just this lower angle, roly-poly terrain, and then they're predominantly traveling on the south-facing slope as they gain access into the Alpine. And as we can see from our wind slab diagram, the wind slab doesn't exist on those south-facing slopes. So hopefully those lines were clear enough, and that gave you guys a chance to think about one final scenario. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Emily, we did get one question.
Okay.
It's a two-part question. It's from
All
Megan.
right.
The question is, if you're on flat terrain and you want to assess the slope angle of the challenging terrain without actually going on the slope, do you just estimate it with your pole in one of the apps? And the second part is, what do you do if you don't have poles with you?
Okay. Yeah, so some of the iPhone apps that I talked about, you can just point those at a slope in front of you and it will tell you the angle of the slope, and then you don't actually have to travel onto it. If you don't have poles with you, hopefully you have a probe and you can use that, your own and a friend's probe, to estimate the angle. There's some great YouTube videos on how to do that. Or if you don't have any of these tools available to you, I would say that guesstimating using the EIGHTS ratings is a really good place to start. So thinking about whether it's simple, challenging, or complex terrain and using that to make decisions, or starting small. And this is kind of what I'm going to start talking about now. So the good travel habits, but you can start small and work your way into bigger terrain. So starting with lesser angle and working your way up. Hopefully that answers your question. I'll just keep moving if there weren't any others. Okay, so now we've covered those scenarios. I'm going to talk quickly about some good travel habits. So regardless of whether you think that the avalanche problem exists in the terrain that you're going to travel through or not, it's good to use these habits all of the time. And a very wise mentor of mine once told me that this is like fighting the smallest guy at the bar. So not biting off more than you can chew, or starting small with things that you can manage before you really duck into that complex terrain or straight into something that would have worse consequences for you. So we want to use good communication, and this is something that can be a little bit challenging to do if you're on the snowmobile just because of the noise. So like I said a little bit earlier in the presentation, helmets off chats are awesome. It's just a quick stop, and we can do that at key decision points before we move into different pieces of terrain. We want to limit our exposure when we're in avalanche terrain, so either traveling one at a time or spacing out through big terrain as much as possible. It goes alongside this that we should look out for our buddies. And when we're sledding, the one at a time thing sometimes relates less to dropping into slopes, but more like how we're starting up slopes. So whether we're going from the bottom and starting to high mark something, it's really good not to all just jump in at once. and to start on something small, one at a time, so that in the event of an accident, only one person is caught and there's a group remaining that's able to rescue them. We want to group up in safe spots. And if we are moving into the terrain, plan an escape route before we do. So thinking about whether we're dropping into a slope from the top or we're going to high mark up it, we want to think about where our safe spots would be or what we're going to do if there was an avalanche. So if I'm starting to move, before I start to move up the slope, I like to think about like, okay, if something does happen, I'm going to turn around to this side because I can start motoring out that way. And then this is where I'm going to head for. That's my safe spot, whether it's on the ridge or way past the run out behind me. Alrighty. And this is just an example of good travel habits. So if this letter here was to just make their way down the valley, up the slope, and start high marking straight into this big terrain, that's not as good of a travel habit as following this blue line, using the ribs and rolls and ridge lines of the terrain, and making our way more slowly through it, using safe spots, escape plans, one at a time, all of those things as we're going along. Already. And here's one last tool that you can have in your pocket. I'm not sure if you guys have seen this before, but this is the evaluator card. You can get these on our website or like a hard copy one that you can carry with you while you're out there. But you'll notice that there's a terrain characteristics box. So you can use this as a decision-making aid to decide what terrain you're going to go into on any given day. And a lot of the characteristics that we've already talked about in the presentation, like slope steepness, terrain traps, and the forest. So whether you're in the alpine tree line or below tree line, these are all things that are going to factor into our decision making. Alrighty, so one last putting it all together. When we're thinking about if the slope is safe to ride or not, is it avalanche terrain? So what's the slope angle? What's the AITS rating? What aspect is it? What elevation band is it? What are the potential consequences, or are there any terrain traps of riding this slope? And then we want to overlay whether there's an avalanche problem on this specific slope. And if we do choose to ride it, how do we do it as safely as possible? So that's quite a lot and to think about while you're out there. And I know that at least for me, it's something that I have to do really consciously. So stopping to take the time and going through this as a process and going through the same thing every time I'm assessing a slope, that really helps to kind of slow down and make sure I'm ticking all of the boxes. Awesome. So in conclusion, use all of those tools that you have available to you to identify the terrain. Because like I said, if we take the terrain piece out from the avalanche triangle, we will not have avalanche hazard. So using those tools to identify whether there's avalanche terrain or not is your first step in staying safe out there or choosing terrain. Apply the forecast to the terrain. Hopefully I hammered that home with all of those different scenarios. And that's something that you can practice at home or get in the habit of doing every time you head out on your sled. Use riding habits that will help you in the case of an avalanche. This one speaks for itself. And use your decision-making aids that you have available to you. And remember that your buddies are decision-making aids as well. So stopping, chatting, and talking about the slopes before you approach them is a really good strategy too. Awesome. All righty, well, that's my presentation. If anyone has any questions, now is a great time to fire them off.
Well, Emily, I don't know. It looks like you filled them full of a boatload of info because we don't have any questions currently. But I know In previous webinars, all it takes is one question to crack the seal, and the next thing you know, we got 5 or 6. But
Yeah. Don't be shy.
anybody put that hand up or looking for a question here, folks? Because, I know if anybody's been reading the forecasts lately, it's definitely a time of train selection and conservative traveling out there currently.
Absolutely. We have such tricky conditions in so many of our regions right now. So yeah, even if you have a specific question that relates to that or a place that you normally ride, feel free to sing out.
Yeah, I think everyone's pondering where they're going now.
Okay.
To get there. Anybody out there? No, this is good. We have good participation there. We got like over 80 folks attending tonight, which is pretty fantastic.
Nice.
Great turnout. Well, folks, one last chance there. It's time to quiz the avalanche tech. Everyone's just giving you the kudos and the thanks and appreciative of your presentation there, Emily.
Alrighty.
Awesome, folks. Well,
Emily, it looks like we do have one question.
Okay.
oh, here we go.
The question is, I guess I would consider myself a beginner, but we ride in the Kakwa area, and most of the time snow is not good. Is this a common pattern? Can you talk a bit about what you're seeing for conditions right now?
I haven't ridden the Kakwa Zone myself. That's in the North Rockies, yeah, and it's like a cabin zone, or a lot of people go there for overnights. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the snow is frequently not good, or like how you want me to expand on that. I guess maybe you're asking like when you're on the flat and the snow isn't good, if there are other areas that you can look for that would be good powder. I know from my own, like, feel free to clarify that question in the chat box if you like, but I know from my own experience, at least what we're seeing right now in the Northwest Inland, so isolated a lot around Smithers and Terrace, and our regular snowmobile areas, especially the ones that are exposed to wind, are still really shallow, and those areas where we would normally find good riding and flat meadows, they're still pretty sharky, full of rocks and wind affected. But what we've been finding is that in more confined valleys, like areas that are little flat meadows that have like surrounding peaks around them, still places where we can avoid overhead exposure, but those have better snow conditions in them right now. I'm not sure if that answers your question, sorry, or if there was any clarification.
We did get one more question.
Okay.
The question is, how does this year compare with having so much less snow than last year? And will we have more stable snow with it coming in slower later this season? So I guess maybe a way to paraphrase that question, Emily, is this a normal year? Are we seeing, a normal snowpack conditions, or how is it different?
Definitely, I would say an abnormal year, especially just given the persistent weak layers and persistent avalanche problems that we've been dealing with in a lot of the regions. What you said about with the snow coming in slower or less intensity, is that safer or is that better? It generally is. In snow science or in avalanche forecasting, we talk a lot about how the snowpack likes gradual change and not fast change. So any kind of rapid loading, so lots of snow, lots of rain, lots of wind, all of those things, or really rapid temperature changes, increases in temperature or drops in temperature, the snowpack really doesn't like any kind of rapid change, and that's when we'll see spikes in avalanche conditions. And whereas if we get gradual change, so slow incremental loading, not much wind, not much temperature change, then we don't see the same wild spikes in avalanche hazard. And that's just a generalization.
Great. We have another question. This question is from Marissa. The question is, what methods do you use for getting your sled unstuck?
Hi, Marissa. Thanks for your question. I have a few different methods. I definitely always try to use a buddy, especially being like a smaller person myself. The sled is massive and heavy, so having 2 or 3 of us either digging or tipping the sled over really helps. What I like to do is, if it's just a little stuck, you can rock your sled to one side, pack snow under the track, and maybe dig it out a little bit from in front, but usually packing the back of the track, if you can get that exposed, is good. Then you want to rock it all the way back the other way, pack on the other side, and then you'll notice that the track is kind of just like, instead of being down here, it's like popped itself up onto the snow. And then usually with a good like hard throttle, you can get out of that stuck. That helps a lot, but I do a lot of digging.
Great, thanks, Emily. And then we
Yeah, no
have
worries.
a couple other questions about the same topic, and I'm going to just combine them. Their questions are from Ryan and Paul, and it is in relation to the persistent slab problems that we're seeing sort of across the snowpack in BC right now. And I put in the link for everyone. We did publish today a blog post that does a great job of explaining this problem and giving some terrain and travel advice. But can you just talk a little bit about the persistent slab problems that we're seeing in the snowpack?
Yeah, definitely. And I can tie it into choosing terrain and travel advice. With a persistent slab problem, it can be really challenging. And I know for everyone across those regions that it's affecting right now, it can be really difficult just being stuck in that mode. In the professional community, we refer to that as an entrenchment mindset, and it's something that we have to actively remind ourselves of every day. So the best terrain and travel advice for a persistent slab problem is to continue avoiding complex or even challenging avalanche terrain. So we want to make really conservative terrain choices, not be sucked in by tracks or any of those kind of other limiting factors or personal heuristics. It can be really challenging, but you have to really stick to your guns and just continue in that conservative terrain, even if it's not something that the sledder inside you wants to do. I don't know. Like I said earlier, we're lucky that on the sleds we can ride in simple terrain and still have a really good time. And at the moment, we've been doing lots of like sled skills and other ways to have fun in the meadows, so that we're distracting ourselves from wanting to ride in any of that bigger terrain.
Great, thanks, Emily.
Yeah, no worries. And yeah, like Lisa said, those blogs are really great on the spore and on persistent and deep persistent weak layers, the difference between them and other things you can employ. And the one final thing I would say about that is that tailored terrain travel advice that you can find when you scroll down below your danger ratings, that might give you some tips or tricks for other places that you might be able to explore. So places that either don't have the problem or have a less shallow snowpack, or have other snowpack conditions and areas where you might be able to ride.
Well, as suspected, you crack the seal and then they just keep pouring in.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks for all of your questions, everyone.
Yeah, it sure makes for a better webinar. Hey, when we get good interaction, it's super awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was
No worries. Thanks, everyone.
comprehensive presentation and a good reminder to really look at and understand the terrain. I think that many people sometimes only look at the danger rating, so many people just look at the colors, red, yellow, green, what's going to be today. But, really it's the avalanche problems are the key to choosing the right terrain and understanding that information and coupling them together with the danger rating. to make the best trip plan. Last season, Simon Horton did a fantastic webinar on avalanche problems. You can check that out in our previous webinar recordings. I think Lisa's going to drop a link in there. Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. And great questions, everybody. You know, keep your heads up out there, read the bulletin. And I'm super stoked to see on that poll that a lot of the people are reading all 3 pages, getting into the details. And, you know, that's so great to see. I think that's really one of those trends that are changing in the avalanche world and the recreationists out there. Super awesome to see. So right now we got these folks hanging around. We haven't lost any. We got some prizes from Lisa. She's pulled some names from the hat, or the list, shall we say. So she is gonna give away some prizes. And if you do get your name out, drop us an email at producer@avalanche.ca. I'll drop that in the chat box for Lisa right now. And she's going to pull out some names. So listen up.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we have some great prizes from Mammut. We have, I don't know if you guys can see this very well. We have 3 Mammut net gaiters. They're really nice. They're black and gray color. We've got 3 of those. And the prize winners for the net gaiters are Jamie May, Parker Williams, and Austin Roberts. So if I just called your name, go ahead and send an email to producer@avalanche.ca with your mailing address, and we will get those to you. And then we do have one more prize from Mammut. It's also kind of hard to see, but it is a really nice blue and black airbag compatible backpack. It's 30 liters, so a great size for a day trip or even a light overnight trip. And the winner for that backpack is Joanna Wasak. And again, shoot an email to producer@avalanche.ca if your name was just called.
Good work. Excellent. Well, that means we're starting to come to an end, folks. Remember, drop an email to producer@avalanche, claim your prizes. There are so many more resources on our website to help you learn more about avalanche safety as well, how to plan your trips in the backcountry. If you're just starting with backcountry education, because it looked like we had a bunch of newbies out tonight, definitely check out our online avalanche tutorial, Avi Savvy. There's great train exercises in there. There's an Avi Savvy link going in the chat box. And even if you think you're a seasoned veteran, check that out. And you can do it in the comfort of your own home and get educated and brush up on all those skills that you have. Thinking about, you know it all, well, maybe you don't. We really appreciate your time tonight, everybody. And we really appreciate your interest in avalanche safety. You can support the essential programs here at Avalanche Canada by donating as little as $10. If you can afford it and would like to help us out, please click on the link in the chat box and donate. So our next webinar is in a couple of weeks. Thursday, January 19th. It's going to be choosing terrain for skiers. It's very similar to this website with fun interactive sessions. They're going to help you assess how to choose terrain depending upon the conditions. Pre-registration is required. And folks, if you have friends that missed this out, it is recorded. We're going to post that up on our website shortly. Thank you all for coming out, spending your time with us this evening, and showing an interest in avalanche safety. We hope you enjoy your winter in the backcountry, safe from avalanches, and have yourself a good night.